Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's structured conversation with Dr. Christine Harrington, Executive Director for the New Jersey Center for Student Success. We look forward to today's discussion and encourage questions and comments. As I mentioned, while we will primarily be using the chat room for discussion today, if you would like to use your microphone at any point, please raise your hand and I will unmute you. With that, my name is Mary Lee Demeter, and I will serve as your moderator today. On behalf of the SOL Professional Development Committee, I thank you for participating in today's structured conversation, and an extra thank you to our guest speaker today, Dr. Harrington. A few logistics before we get started. Please feel free to adjust your chat screen using your mouse. I encourage you to participate by chatting in your questions and comments in the chat box at the bottom left of the audio and video screen. Also, if you would like to insert emoticons at any point, if you look under your name in the participants window, you'll see a little icon with a smiley face, so you can insert emoticons. The next over is to let others know you've stepped away. As you can see, I just hit that I stepped away even though I'm really here, but you could use that if you need to leave the session for a few minutes. If you would like to raise your hand to use your microphone, the little hand icon next to that, you can use that and I can unmute you. And finally, that fourth icon all the way to the right with the checkbox in it, that will be how we respond to polls, and there will be 3 polls during today's session. So we encourage you to participate using that icon to indicate your selection. So today our conversation will focus on the role of the first year experience course and assessment approaches used to measure learning outcomes and support student success. We will review the history and purpose of the first year experience course. Then we will explore strategies to assess the course from both an academic and student services and student affairs perspective. As I mentioned, today's guest speaker is Dr. Christine Harrington, and she is the Executive Director for the Center for Student Success at the New Jersey Council of Community Colleges. She has taught psychology and student success courses for over 15 years at Middlesex County College in Edison, New Jersey, where I had the pleasure of working with her. She was a fantastic colleague, and I do miss being on campus up at Middlesex. She also served as the director of the Center for Enrichment of Teaching and Learning, or CELT, for 5 years, and as the assessment coordinator at Middlesex for 3 years. She's also the author of Student Success in College, Doing What Works, now out in 2nd edition, and a research-based text for the first year seminar course, and the recipient of the 2016 Excellence in Teaching First Year Seminars Award. Her latest book, Dynamic Lecturing, published by Stylus, will be available coming this July of 2017. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Harrington to today's conversation.
Thanks so much, Mary Lee, and thanks to both you and Whitney for pulling together, the preparation needed to get a webinar like this off of the ground. So I really appreciate the opportunity, and I'll just ask all of you to bear with me. I'm using my telephone because my microphone on the computer just wasn't cooperating today, but I think that we'll have a good time this afternoon as we talk about assessment and the first year experience. So I'm going to begin by just talking about what my objectives are. I know you're an assessment crowd, so I want to make sure we're focused on what the learning outcomes are going to be and why we're spending this next hour together and what you can hope to accomplish as a result of this time together. So you can see here there are 4 different learning outcomes. The first one is, by the end, I think you'll be able to describe the purpose and typical learning outcomes of the first year experience course. I will note that they do vary, so there's not like one set that's kind of critical for all first year experience courses, but we'll talk about kind of the spirit of what those learning outcomes typically are. The second objective is that you'll be able to determine some direct and indirect assessment methods that are connected to the course learning outcomes. Obviously, that will be dependent upon the specific learning outcomes for the course that you're assessing. The third objective for the day is to identify assessment strategies that can address the student services components of the course. So as Mary Lee mentioned in the introduction, the FYE course is very much a course that is built not only through the academic part of the institution, but in many cases it's often owned or housed in the student affairs area, and even when it's not housed there, it definitely is very much integrated often into the course. So we'll talk about how those different service components such as library visits or advising sessions, things of that nature can be assessed. And then finally, last but not least, you'll be able to discuss how assessment data can be used to improve the first year experience course. So that's kind of to set the stage, the agenda for the day. I'm going to begin by just giving you a very, very brief overview, a historical perspective really on the first year seminar. So these courses date back for a long, long time. In fact, Ryan and Glenn noted that they started back in the mid-1800s. And the first purpose or reason for the course was really to help students who weren't quite prepared for the rigor and the higher level focus in a college environment. Later in the 1800s, they kind of shifted and it became something that was offered to all first-year students. So it wasn't really just the at-risk students, but then they started to discover that maybe all students really needed a first-year experience course and could benefit from focus on some of those transitional issues and really kind of that extended orientation model a little bit. Then in the 1950s and 60s, we shifted a little bit more back to focusing on students who didn't quite have the academic preparation, and a heavier emphasis was placed on learning strategies, helping students really build and grow some of the strategies that they may have already had in high school, but expanding on those so that they're able and better equipped to deal with the high-level tasks associated with the college environment. And then you can see here on the last bar is in the 70s and 80s, the shift kind of happened again to more of an extended orientation approach when student services, would put together orientation programs. They were phenomenal, but as you know, you can only accomplish so much in a half a day or a full day or even 2 or 3 day event. So I think that what happened is that a lot of times the FYE course was looked at as, maybe those transition items that we wanted to talk about in the summer orientation program need to be integrated into that first semester as well, so that some of that information comes to students at a time when they need it. So you'll see we kind of been back and forth, bumping around a little bit in terms of the different approaches to the FYE course. So I actually have a first poll question, and this is really just kind of a guessing kind of question. What do you think best captures the current trend? Do you think currently are we spending more time looking at the extended orientation approach, or does it seem like the FYE courses are focused more on an academic approach to the FYE course? So I know Mary Lee and Whitney are going to be modulating the poll, I believe, and there's the little A, B, and C and none under your name, the fourth icon you should see. So if you haven't already answered, you can please go ahead and answer the poll. Again, one more time for those of you who are having trouble finding it. If you're new to Blackboard Collaborate, under your name you'll see 4 little icons. The fourth one has a little A, and you can go ahead and do a drop down and select your response for that question.
Now I will publish the results shortly. I see a lot of folks have already responded. I'll just give it a couple more seconds before I publish.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Mary Lee. And I'm sure some of you would like that C option, I know, but I've made you do a forced choice here. So thanks for playing along with me.
Great. I would say we probably have a good number of responses. Are we ready to publish?
Okay. Sure, go for it.
Here we go.
Okay, so we can see here from the bar graph that most of you, the majority of you, are saying B. You think it has more of an academic focus, although there is about 20% of you who did select A, more the extended orientation. Now, of course, it's kind of a trick question because many of our courses aren't one or the other, but I will tell you, as you can see on this slide, that the academic approach is definitely on the upward trend, whereas the extended orientation is on the downward trend. So you can see the number of courses that are viewing themselves as primarily extended orientation has dropped from the early 90s to 2012, from 71% down to 60%. And you can see there are a variety of different types of academic approaches. Some have the same content, so it's kind of like a standardized course that might teach, these certain study strategies and these kinds of academic skills, whereas others might have variable content, so maybe it's more housed within, psychology might have its own course, biology might have a different one, engineering might have a different one, but you're still going to be talking about more of an academic skills component. And then you can see some have a purely study skills kind of emphasis. So I guess the key takeaway from this is that there definitely is a growing trend towards more of an academic focus in the course. Now, I mentioned right in the beginning that this is a course that probably has the most collaboration, compared to any other course on campus. I'm pretty much ready to go ahead and go out on a limb and make that kind of statement. And again, sometimes that's because the course grew up in student affairs. It may have been born on that campus through the counseling office or advising office or just general student affairs division. In other cases, it really grew out of the academic affairs area. In either case, no matter where it really started, this course is a perfect example of how we can bridge our student affairs and academic affairs parts of our campuses together to really benefit students, because that's what this course is all about. It's often called a student success course. If it's not called the first year experience, it is often also referred to as that student success course. So by partnering between the academic affairs and student affairs, we're definitely going to have a much higher success rate for our students. So let's talk for a moment about learning outcomes so that you can have a sense of what those learning outcomes might be. What you have in front of you here are learning outcomes that were actually developed collaboratively across our 19 community colleges here in New Jersey. So in my new position as Executive Director for the Center of Student Success, one of the initiatives that I have taken on is really trying to elevate this course and bring the expertise from across the state together. So let's really look at what we can accomplish in this course. And through this wonderful effort, just a significant amount of effort and work from so many different student success course coordinators from across the state, we came up with the following learning outcomes. Now you'll notice the top part, we actually built in kind of another learning outcome into it. There's higher sense of self-efficacy. And actually one of our colleagues, I think, at Raritan Valley, I think it was Kathy Sook, who really kind of pushed for this to happen, saying that it's kind of like the underpinning of all that we do. So it really belongs, I think, center stage on the top. So the idea here is that we want to build our student self-efficacy, and there's a variety of ways in which we can do that, and a variety of outcomes that we're looking for as a result of this course. So some of it is about figuring out what resources there are and how you can best use those resources, as well as strategies. So some of it may be success-based strategies. For instance, in the career world, that might be networking strategies. In the academic skills component, it might be study strategies. What kind of resources exist? Well, that might be career services if you're talking about career issues, or it might be tutoring services or professors or librarians if you're talking about academic issues. So you can see here it's pretty broad so that it encompasses all of that. And then, of course, we're trying to move up that Bloom's taxonomy and really focus on high-level cognitive tasks such as critical thinking and information literacy and the integration of technological skills into what we do. We spent a lot of time talking about how some of the soft skills need to also be addressed in this course, and you can see from the third learning outcome here that we focus a lot on interpersonal and leadership skills that are going to help them, students be successful in a global diverse society. In addition, many FYE courses focus on reflection, metacognitive kinds of tasks to help students determine whether or not they're on track to meet their goal and achieve that goal, to reflect on their decisions and their behaviors and whether or not those are resulting in positive consequences both for themselves and also for others. And then one other really important one that we wanted to do was to have students create academic, financial, and career plans. So it's not like we're asking them to be boxed into a certain career, but to figure out what path is really going to best serve them. So these are learning outcomes that many of our colleges here in New Jersey are using, but clearly they are not the only kinds of learning outcomes. So all the assessments that we talk about, as you know as assessment folks, has to be driven by whatever the learning outcomes are. So I'm using these as a model, but it's important for you to know that if you don't have a learning outcome about leadership, then you wouldn't want to assess that because that's not, what your course is focused on. And same would be true if you're not doing academic and career planning in your class, then you wouldn't want to figure out assessments related to that. You want to tie your assessment method and delivery of content to your learning outcomes. Okay, so one other thing I wanted to mention to you, and I think this is kind of an important one from a global standpoint of assessment, is mapping. So I'm sure you're all fairly familiar with mapping courses to program outcomes. So let's say, for instance, if I take psychology, for instance, as a psychology major, we're expecting students to be able to do certain things. So you'll have program level outcomes, 1, 2, 3, whatever they might be. By mapping the courses to determine which courses are going to tap into which of those program learning outcomes, it's a very powerful way to see if the curriculum that you've built is going to get you where you want it to get the students to at the end of the day. So I would say to you that it's really important to map out, map out your courses to your program maps. Now, here's where the FYE course comes into play. For some of you, this might be a required course for all of your students, and then it should be in all of those maps. For others, it may not be required of any students. It may be optional, or it may be required by some students. And for some of you, you might be trying to make the case, so to speak, that this course should be required of all students, which, by the way, is my belief, based on all of the research and data out there about the powerful impact of this course. And we'll talk in a moment about some of that national data. So if you are either trying to make the case or you already do have a situation where your course is already required in programs, you want to help all of those academic areas understand how your course ties into whatever their program learning outcomes are. So I just, on this slide, obviously that it's going to vary depending on what those program learning outcomes would be, but I put a couple of general ones that might be up there for, some gen ed type learning outcomes. Many programs, whether it's engineering or psychology or biology or computer science, will probably have some kind of reference to critical thinking, perhaps interpersonal skills, perhaps learning the content of that discipline. And if that's the case, then what you can do is take what you see in the boxes underneath those are actually the learning outcomes. So if I just bounce back here for a minute, you'll see I just took the actual learning outcomes and I put them into the boxes so that we could visualize to our colleagues how this course connects and supports what they're doing at the program level. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense to you. I certainly will entertain questions along the way. If you have any, you can put them into chat. But I actually am going to ask you to respond to a question in the chat feature now. So instead of polling, please go into chat and answer this question. Why should we assess the FYE course? So if you can take a couple of minutes and jot down your answers, that would be great. Okay, to improve things, to determine best practices, I see. Show impact, absolutely. Yeah, you have to know, are you meeting the learning outcomes? That's absolutely critical. Yep, are we meeting the learning outcomes? I see that in several of your responses. What are students learning? How do we know? Identifying how it connects Lots of resources. So we might be offering and maybe we're requiring it from everybody, but maybe we're not even doing a good job, I see some of you even mentioning. And that certainly can be the case. So there's lots of great responses here. Just scanning to see if I missed anything else. It looks like, yes, a lot of resources go into it, and we have to sometimes kind of show that those resources are being spent wisely, right? Absolutely. And are we meeting the needs of our students? Well, thank you. Lots of great responses there. Those are all very valid reasons, very important reasons, and I think it's important for us to always think about the why. You know, I mean, assessment should be built into what we do on a daily basis, but not in a robotic kind of way, in a purposeful way. So pausing to ask yourself the why question, why am I doing this assessment, is a really important step. Now, I'm going to tell you that I think there are two primary whys. In the FYE course in particular, you know, and this could be for other reasons as well, but when I wore the assessment hat on my campus, I often talk to folks about there's two different kinds of assessment really, the prove it and the improve it. So the prove it is, if we're spending all this money on this resource, how do we know it's working? We want to see some results. So the prove it is, you know, are students staying in school? Are they graduating? Some of those kinds of assessments, I think, fall into that prove it category. The improve it category, on the other way, you know, is a different question, because how can we do this better? And I saw a couple of you actually comments about that in the chat a couple minutes ago when you said, well, I want to know what we're doing, best practices really. So that's going to dive a little bit deeper to look at, well, what delivery method works best? So for instance, maybe you are trying to make some decisions about whether this course should have discipline-specific focus or whether it should be more of a general focus, and if there's a benefit of one versus another. Well, assessment data could help you with that, right? You could look at your own internal assessment. You can compare it, you know, if you had a couple of different versions of the course, that might be helpful. Maybe you're looking at, you know, looking at the emphasis of the course. So, for instance, one of the things that we talked about in New Jersey was really trying to increase the focus on career. Well, let's do a deeper dive, and how can this course maybe impact students and their career decision-making process? So we might want to look to see, does it help to have a variety of guest speakers on different careers come in, or are students who are doing a deeper dive and doing maybe a research project related to careers doing, you know, making more progress in that space, or perhaps it's not either one of those, and maybe it's something totally different. Maybe it has to do with learning how to network, and the networking actions are, you know, most critical. So by looking at the different kinds of delivery approaches to the course, we can get a little bit of a better handle on what works best. I also put a bullet here to talk about integration of student services. So in this course, many of us, I mean, it is a very, very common occurrence to have guest presenters. So it might be something such as the librarians are showing them how to use the library resources. It might be something like academic advisors, or career counselors are coming in, or transfer counselors, or whoever it might be, to talk about the different services that they offer and making sure students know about them and take advantage of them. But I guess the question that I always raise is, well, why are we doing that? You know, so we need to think about it. And obviously on the face value, you can understand why you might want to do that, but do we know, does that work? You know, are we, because again, thinking about resources, if you have 50 sections of a course and you have, you know, maybe 3 counselors or something on your campus, is this the best use of their time to be going around to the classes? Would a video be just as effective? Would it not? I think those are questions that we need to assess in order to really know and guide our actions. So we could all have guesses about that, but we may not really know whether or not, you know, this approach works better than that approach without really doing assessment. So I'm going to pause now for another poll question, and this question really asks, what are you usually asked for in terms of the FYE? Does it fall into the prove it category, the improve it category, or both? So again, if you can use a little, the 4th icon underneath your name to answer the poll, that would be excellent.
quite a few folks have answered. I'll give it a 10, 20 more seconds or so for a few more responses before I publish.
Perfect. Thanks, Mary Lee.
All right. We only have a few non-responses, so I'll go ahead and publish that now.
Perfect.
And here we go.
Okay, so sadly, it seems like the improve it's the smallest category, but it seems like both is a pretty big category, but it looks like most of you responded. The majority, the highest percentage anyway, was in the prove it category. And I guess the part that frustrates me about that is if I did the same question and said, hey, why are you assessing your anatomy and physiology class? You know, do you have to prove that you need that to be a health science major, or do you have to do it to see whether they're actually learning and to see if you can improve it? And my guess would be that for most of our other academic courses, we are going to have improve it kinds of questions being asked instead of the prove it. And I find that to be offensive, honestly. I've got to be honest with you, because this is a really important course, and we already know that it works, but people are not aware of it. So we do have to do a better job at really helping our campus community understand the value of this course. So we're going to talk a minute about Prove It, because I know that many of you are being asked for it. You just told me that. I know that. I was always asked for it too, and you kind of have to have some thick skin in order to be in charge of this class, because you have to be ready to, always be able to defend what you're doing, and it can be frustrating, but I think we have to just view it as a, an teachable moment, an opportunity to teach others really about what it is that this course does and does well. So we have a lot of national data, and I'm going to go through just a little bit of it just to give you a sampling of what exists out there. And I guess my question is do we need to then, if this national data exists, do we need to then prove it at our local level? Or do we need to really go and get that national data and use that to prove the worthiness of the course? Because let's face it, assessment is extremely time-consuming, and when you integrate it, it makes it less time-consuming, but the truth of the matter is it's still time-consuming. It's a use of resources, and I'm always a fan of using resources in a way that's going to help us move forward. And again, if you're in the process of trying to convince folks that you need this course for everyone on your campus, then you may need to play in this space of Prove It data to help them understand the value of it. And by all means, it might be a very good use of your resources. But I think it's kind of silly for every single campus across the United States to have to do the same thing. I don't think we're all that different. I think we're more similar than dissimilar in many ways. So I think that's kind of one of the points that I wanted to raise here. So let me share. This is a snapshot of some data, and actually in New Jersey, we're working on compiling a lot of this data into this infographic tool, and we're very close to having it ready. And as soon as it's ready, I'm happy to share it widely. So if you'd like to get a copy of that when it's done, you can email me. My email is charrington@njccc.org, charrington@njccc.org. I'll have it on the last slide. I believe it's there also. But we know, there's national data out there that students who take this course have better grades, are more likely to stay in school, more likely to graduate on time, so in a more timely fashion, which is very important given the amount of financial debt that students have. They also are more likely to engage in a lot of activities that we value in higher education and employers value, like reflecting on progress. So they're more engaged in that metacognitive process, which will likely carry through not only through the rest of their college career, but on the job. We need to reflect on how we're doing with everything that we engage in. Thinking more critically, having more self-confidence, being more of a participator, and having a better sense of your career options. So the research out there is pretty clear that there's a lot of data. Now, one of the challenging things, I'm a psychologist, and obviously the premier, most robust type of data is experimental data. I will tell you that most of this is not experimental data because we don't really have that set up to do in higher education. Our students won't like it very much if we're randomly assigning them to different kinds of courses and all. So we can't always talk with, absolute certainty based on some of those studies. But when you start to get study after study after study, and some of these are not independent studies, but meta-analysis and review of other studies, when you start to see very consistent findings across multiple institutions, community colleges, prestigious four-year schools, technical schools, for all kinds of students, it starts to speak pretty loud and clear as far as I'm concerned. So I think one of the things that we want to do is spend more time really compiling this national data, and that's why I'm doing that in New Jersey to help the colleges here be able to make the case on their campus so that they can then spend their assessment efforts and energies and resources more productively on the Improve It camp. Okay, so now we're going to shift gears because in case you haven't discovered this already, the Improve It is what I'm most passionate about because I think that's where we really get pretty excited about how can we do this even better. And instead of just using your gut reaction, we're formalizing it through an assessment process. Now, the truth of the matter is that we all do this informally all the time. So if you're someone who teaches this course, I am fairly confident that you leave the class and you start thinking about what went well, what didn't go well, what you might do differently. And that's great on an individual level. But we need to kind of elevate that and look at it across the course level to see what is working well and what's not. So here you can see there's just a couple of ideas, and this is certainly not an exhaustive list, but just a couple of thought provokers, hopefully to get you thinking about different ways that you can look at how to assess the course. But I'd love to see us do more looking at the different approaches, and I know this is a tough sell because you may not be able to convince your campus community to have multiple versions of the course, but maybe we can partner with another institution, so maybe we can look at one college who's doing it with major specific and then have them partner with another college that's doing the generalist approach. Maybe the two of those colleges can get together and maybe even collaborate over the syllabus so that most of it's the same, but it's being delivered in two different ways. And then we can get a little bit more data on that. We do have some data on that question nationally, but there's not a ton of it, honestly, and it's a little mixed out there. It doesn't seem to be like one is a winner over the other, but I'm not sure we have enough data to be able to confidently say that that's definitely the case. So I think that that's an area that I'd love to see some more assessment on it. The other is there's a growth in online options for this course, and in fact, some cases schools are only doing an online version of the course. So we can look at, again, the different approaches and what seems to work better. And I would caution you that just because one approach works better than another doesn't mean we throw out the other approach, but maybe how can we do that even better? So let's say, for instance, the data comes back and it says, the face-to-face seems to be working better than the online. Well, that doesn't mean, okay, policy now, we're not going to have online courses anymore. Well, wait a minute, we got to dive deeper. Are there certain kinds of students who are doing better on the online? I know at our institution we took a little bit of a closer look at that, and it seems to be that some of the more older students who maybe were parents or had military experience and had, kind of more of that self-discipline, seems to do better in the online classes as compared to some of the, fresh out of high school 18-year-old students who may have struggled a little bit more in that. Again, that's a very general kind of statement to make, but I think the idea is we want to dive deeper into what works best for who. As I mentioned before, you might want to look at different kinds of assignments that you do. So in New Jersey, many of us, as we came across, we came together across the state, we all pretty much did something on career, but in many cases it was a career information focused activity. And we talked about how we really wanted to elevate that to be more of a networking, skill development opportunity, still getting information, but then putting that information into practice and starting to develop some networking skills. So if we're going to do something like that, and this is actually a little easier to do when you have different assignments, so you could still have the same structure of the class, but maybe some classes have an assignment that's more information information-based, and another one that's more action-based based on networking skills and behaviors. Service learning is another component. We actually did an interesting study on that at Middlesex. We had, there was like 5 sections that did a service learning component on financial literacy. And what they did was, it was really kind of a neat process. They learned about, financial literacy, but in a way that they had to be able to then teach it to other courses who did not learn about it in their section. So it was a peer teaching process. And then we looked to see, how that worked. And the students who taught about financial literacy had the biggest bang for their buck, so to speak, because they obviously knew it in a really deep way. But it transferred also into the students who learned from their peers about it. So, building in some creative projects and assignments of that nature really can be quite interesting to assess to see what works really well. The last one is going back into, if we think about the student services element, looking at advising or career components, what works best? If you're doing assessments, does that seem to have an impact? Are you doing advising, and if so, what's the format of that? What are you focused on? How is that being delivered? So looking at the different ways in which we do things can be pretty powerful. Now, as you move along in this process, I have this mantra, and I said this mantra, I can't even count how many times when I wore the assessment hat on my campus. It's got to be manageable and meaningful. If it's not, I say don't do it. I think you can't take on the world. You got to take on small chunks that are going to be something that you can actually do. And it has to bring or add value. And that's where I think the prove it doesn't always do that. Again, unless you need to make the case on your campus, maybe it's going to make a huge difference. But if you've already made the case, then it probably isn't going to add much value to say, guess what, it's still working. Instead, adding value might be, hey, this approach seems to work better than this approach for this type of student. So kind of diving a little bit deeper. So what we can see here is that there are a variety of ways that you can do that. I see a quick note in there. Yep, absolutely. Mary Lee already took care of that question. So yes, all the slides and the recording will be available to you. So in terms of some strategies, one is maybe you don't target all of the learning outcomes all at once. You decide which one you want to focus on. So for instance, one of the learning outcomes in that list I gave you was creating academic, career, and financial plans. Maybe that's your focus for one semester. The other thing is that you want to try to figure out what's already being utilized. So if you're already doing maybe career assessments or you already have academic planning documents in place, think about how you might use those as some of your outcome data for the course. So if they have to write up something based on their career assessment, maybe it's a reflection paper, maybe they're handing in an academic plan, and you'd be able to use a rubric and really determine whether or not they successfully completed that task. The more specific you are, I think the more likely it is you're going to be able to make some significant change. So we don't want to do just a global, hey, is this class beneficial to you? Yes, no. Well, if they say no, we don't know what to do with that. So we want to be a little bit more specific. So let's talk a minute about direct and indirect types of assessment methods that we can use. I'm going to start by, this is all pulled from the Middle States folks, and you see here a long list of direct methods and indirect methods. I'm actually going to pause for a minute. I'm not going to read these to you and just let you go ahead and take a minute to read them, and then I'll talk a little bit more specifically about them in just a moment. Okay, so there's a variety of ways that you can approach direct and indirect assessment for this course. One, direct assessment method, obviously the good old mighty tests. That's one of the things that we do quite a bit. So if you're using any tests, I would just say that you don't want to only do, again, a final exam grade. You'd want to look at the different components. Which pieces are they really mastering? Are they really understanding, maybe the career theories and processes? Are they really understanding the study skills? Or maybe they're a little bit weaker in information literacy or critical thinking, whatever it might be. So you want to be able to have some specificity surrounding that. So looking at subscales and components of a test is much more valuable than looking at an overall test grade. And then the other thing is rubrics. So again, I mentioned already, when there's something that's already integrated into your class, like maybe it's a presentation, a paper, an academic plan, whatever it might be, looking at those tools that already exist, and if rubrics don't already exist, to create the rubrics, to use those in a way. And you don't have to do it for every student. You can do assessment by taking a random sample from each class. So instead of, let's say you had 50 sections and 20 students in each section, you could just imagine how long it would take to look at all the rubrics for all those. Well, maybe you decide you're going to look at rubrics for 30 students, and you're going to randomly pick 2 or something from each class. I guess that would put us at 40, but you get the point. You know, you wouldn't have to look at every single one. So by having a standardized assignment in the class and some kind of standardized assessment tool makes it easier to know whether or not it's working. I would mention to you that a lot of times people use rubrics that aren't really that helpful. If you're just going to say, well, excellent use of skills and adequate use of skills and poor, you know, demonstration of skills, well, those don't really, you know, help anyone understand what excellent or poor means. So you want to define those. All right, we're going to shift to indirect assessment. I think this is an underutilized approach. I think everyone is so hyper-focused sometimes on that direct approach that we need to also think about how we might use some indirect assessments. So one thing that I've done in my classes, I'm just going to flip to the next page, is a self-assessment of learning outcomes. So here are the first 2 that we had identified in New Jersey, and at the end of the semester, if you just ask them, you know, are you able to do this on a scale of 1 to 5? Clearly, it's an indirect method because you're getting their opinion based on it. But I'll tell you that my students don't judge themselves all equally on all areas. So I often would see, they're not feeling strong enough in this, maybe critical thinking space. But you know what? They're feeling pretty strong in knowing about the campus resources, knowing about study strategies, things of that nature. So this can be useful, and it's super easy to collect. So talk about manageable, that one's totally manageable. Another indirect assessment is reflection paper, and a lot of us do this at the end of the course anyway. So, you know, I do think that can be another important way for us to get some of that indirect. It may not be, not all data needs to be quantitative in nature. Sometimes we get some really rich quotes from our students that we might want to extract and pull into an assessment report, and they may come from things like reflection papers. Now, I do want to give you a caution. Sometimes folks like to do the pre and the post-test assessment in an FYE class. In fact, there's many publishers that have tools like that look at those different approaches. And the truth of the matter is that oftentimes the scores go down instead of up. And it looks bad, but it's not always bad. So let's take, for instance, there was a research study by Howard who looked at the pre and post assessment in different areas. Well, some went up, like they gained confidence in knowing about resources. But actually it went down in terms of their career decision making. But that's not always bad. Sometimes you're going to get more confused when you're actually engaged in the process, and then you will be less confused as you start to explore it, and maybe the one semester wasn't enough to show that. And there's also a question here is about more realistic self-appraisal. Absolutely, Whitney. You know, in the beginning, everyone thinks they're fabulous, and then reality hits in, and they get some feedback to the contrary. So they do have more, perhaps, realistic and accurate self-assessments at the end of the semester. So we're going to try something that we haven't tried yet before. We're going to try a breakout room, and we're not going to spend a long time in it, but if we could spend even 3 to 5 minutes, I'm going to ask Whitney and Mary Lee to work their magic. They're going to put you into a breakout room, and if you have audio, you should be able to then talk with just a couple of others about this question, and then we'll come back as a large group, and we'll continue on with the presentation. So I'll turn it over to Mary Lee if you want to put them in the breakout rooms and let them know what they need to do. We can't hear you, Mary Lee. Mary Lee, we can't hear you. You're muted or something. So we see you talking at us. There you are. Now we can hear you.
I don't think I properly turned my talk back on as I was going up to also get the breakout rooms ready. So I'm going to set us up for 7 different breakout rooms, so we get about 5 to 6 people in each breakout room. So Whitney, I'll need your help, like unmuting people. Raise your hand if you're going to chat. Otherwise, we could just chat into the chat box. And let's see, we are at 1:45 p.m. So do we want to regroup at 1:49? Does that sound good?
Yes, perfect. Yep. I think that'll be enough time for them to at least get a little bit of a dialogue going, and then we'll come back together.
Okay, so I will be creating the rooms now, and we'll pop into rooms with you. And we'll see you in a few minutes. Back as a whole group. All right.
Okay, Mary, do you want me to pick up again?
Yeah, go for it. Okay, I was hoping we got everybody back in. I think we did.
Oh, good. Hope we didn't lose anybody and trap them in a room. So if you're able to hear and you're not feeling like you're back in the main room, underneath your name, I think there is a button that you can click down and switch to the main room. So hopefully, I don't know if that's just for us or not, but hopefully everybody's back together again. So I hope that works. I'll be interested to actually hear about how that worked. I'm not sure. We tried something new, so we'll see how it goes. I do have a poll that I would like to ask everyone to answer, and I know you're all pros at this already because you've done it a few times. So I guess this is one way we'll know if you're back, if you answer the poll. So if you can go ahead and put your answer for A, B, C, or D based on this question, what role student services professionals play in the FYE course, that would be great.
Okay, and I'll give us a few minutes before I go and publish.
Yep.
back. About 10 more seconds.
Perfect.
All right, I will go ahead and publish those results now.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. So it looks like actually there's an even split almost between either having student services being available for guest presentations or that and guiding the curriculum. It looks like only one of you said that student services is not really involved at all. So I think this highlights the important point that we are really working collaboratively together, hopefully student services and the academic side of the house, to really pull off a strong FYE course that's going to help students meet with success. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time, the last few minutes that we have together, really focused on how do we assess the student services components of the FYE course. As I said before, there's a variety of ways that they can be involved. Oftentimes they're involved by doing presentations, but it's not the only way that they're involved. And student services are a little trickier to assess sometimes than courses. I know that my academic friends always felt like it was a challenging task to figure out how to assess a course, but I will tell you that assessing services is even more challenging. So here are some direct and indirect methods. I'm just going to pause for a minute so you can read that. I don't need to read the whole slide to you, and then we'll talk about it a little bit more in depth in a moment.
Really quick, Dr. Harrington, while we're having folks read, is your video turned on?
Oh.
Okay. I'm trying to get you back up.
Is it back?
Yeah, and I've actually had to finagle with it since you're on the phone, so I think you might have been kicked off in the breakout rooms.
Oh, maybe that's what happened. Am I back on now? I see myself. Do you see me?
Yeah, now I just need to make you bigger.
Make it bigger. Okay. You make me bigger.
I don't know how I did that before, but
if you can make me smaller in real life, Mary Lee, that'll make me even happier. How's that? Okay. Yeah, so I'm just, well, before I jump to some more specifics, I see there's a comment that Beth talks about her campus moves to an online course evaluation. The response rate definitely goes down. And, that is really true because it's a pro and con. You have to weigh the pros against the cons. Having more data so that it's more comprehensive, but then you need the manpower to do all those scantrons and all versus, not getting as much. It's not, I don't have there's not an easy answer. I think you just have to weigh the pros and cons and see what happens. I think having shorter responses and figuring out the best time to submit those electronic ones matters, and making sure you're not assessing everything. So the students are getting hit with electronic surveys for every course at the end of the semester in the same 2-day period while they're also studying for finals, probably not going to respond. But maybe we can do some of our assessments, especially in the FYE course, earlier versus later. And that's definitely something I would say for the student services. So there are some direct assessment methods that we can use based on the student services component. So for instance, we use quiz questions to talk about all the other content that we do in the class. Why not about, if the librarian is teaching some library resources or the advisors are teaching about some advising and curriculum issues, why not giving them a quick quiz to see did they grab the key takeaways from the lecture part of the presentation that they gave. The other one is observing performance. So if we're teaching, let's say, in a library class, for instance, how to use the library databases, are we could we go around the room and even like with a quick tally be able to say, well, how many of the students were able to go in without support to get to the library databases? So if you log them all the way out, can they follow that breadcrumb trail back to where they were, or are they not able to do that? Or are they going to see an advisor you know, and writing down when they meet with the advisor, do they know that this course counts as a social science elective versus a humanities elective? Do they understand what the core part, you know, the gen ed part of the curriculum is? You know, you could observe some of their performance by their class selections and things of that nature. Indirect assessment methods can include satisfaction surveys, and again, you don't need to do all of those at the end of the semester. In fact, it sometimes can be helpful to do them shortly after the presentation. So if you have someone coming in the middle of the semester to assist with registration and advising, maybe a survey about how was that? Did you feel like you had your needs met? You know, is this a good approach, or do you prefer not having this integrated into the class and doing this outside of class, and why? Also activities. So sometimes the student services are coming because they want you to go to the library and use the librarian resources sometimes, or they want you to know about the tutoring services. Are we tracking how many of our students are going to those activities? Now, we can't make causal statements about it just because they came to class. We know that that's why they went to tutoring, but we could look at, you know, trend data and certainly look at patterns and things of that nature. So I'm just encouraging you to think about the different kinds of assessment data you might be able to collect through, you know, variety of mechanisms to know whether or not the student services components are working. Now, I will say, you know, kind of as a final, you know, piece of today, in addition to my manageable yet meaningful mantra, I have another mantra that's called productive, not perfect. You know, assessment is not going to be perfect. We're not setting up those experimental studies that psychologists love. We're doing assessment in real live situations. We have to do the best that we can. We always want to try to use multiple measures when possible. It's great to mix a direct and an indirect method together so we can look to see, is the data telling us the same story, or is it not consistent? We need to figure out what data is going to be meaningful and actionable, like what kind of data is going to guide us in terms of what we're doing, and I think that's the kind of data that we want. So I always tell, you know, faculty or administrators who are looking at assessment, okay, pretend you asked that question, pretend you gathered that, and pretend these are the results. Would it guide you? And that, like a great example of that is like knowing the final exam grade on a test. Okay, so the average was a C. Now what? Is that, well, I'm not satisfied with that. Okay, so but what are you going to do to improve it? Does it give you anything? Maybe it gives you enough to know that you have to look more deeply at the exam, but maybe you could find something out earlier than that that would give you a better understanding. If you broke it down into assessment components, it would be much better. So it needs to be productive, it doesn't need to be perfect, and the more you integrate it, the better it will be because it makes it just more manageable again. If you just integrate it into your daily life and you just do it as the way you do all curriculum and other things. So with our last minute or so left, I'm going to actually ask you to do two things. One is to talk about what your key takeaway, you know, at least one takeaway from today's webinar is. We're going to use the chat feature for that. And if you also have any feedback on whether the chat, the breakout room worked or didn't work, we'd love to hear that from you as well. And then we'll come back together, you know, in about, you know, just 1 minute to just wrap up and, you know, conclude it at 2 o'clock. So if you can put your takeaways in the chat, that would be great. Oh, breakout didn't work. That stinks. Thanks for letting us know. It was a good try anyway.
I agree. When we first met to discuss this session and we talked about breakouts, we said, hey, why not try it? and we'll ask. And if folks don't think it's very useful, we certainly don't need to go there again. But thanks everybody for trying, and let us know.
So scheduling the evaluations while they're in the lab was a suggestion. We've decided to use their platforms as an introduction to evaluations, so you'll be evaluating other courses later. Okay, so that kind of helps. I love that.
You know, I also want to share, you know, when we were talking earlier about prove it and improve it, one thing I definitely said to students when I was teaching student success was, first of all, if there was any kind of graduation data, back then wasn't really focusing on it too much. But I would kind of give an overview and explain how maybe previous students might have commented on how the course helped them. And I always went in on day one of the semester and said, here's what we're doing. Oh, and by the way, I used to do it this way, but last semester's course evaluation, the students didn't really like it that much, so you can thank them for why we are doing this now. And usually the students
you give them actual examples, Mary Lee. Like, that's great. I love it.
Yeah, I noticed that it would actually bump up course evaluations and feedback and just the willingness to participate and kind of become part of that campus culture, because they're part of the campus too. It's not just the faculty and staff.
I love that. So I do want to be respectful. I see lots of great takeaways. Thank you so much. It looks like you like to prove it and improve it, the mix of direct and indirect, not having to do everything, kind of following those manageable yet meaningful and productive, not perfect mantras. So I'm glad that you're finding that helpful. So I just want to conclude by really thanking all of you for your participation and your flexibility, especially if the breakout room didn't work so well for you. And here's my contact information. This is the website for the Center for Student Success. We will be posting that infographic thing up there once it's finished. So if you're looking for that, you can certainly check it out on our website, or you can, of course, email me also. So I'm happy to stay on the line if anyone wants to, have some further dialogue or questions, but I know many of you also probably are running off to another meeting or to class, so I don't want to have it run later, but thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Harrington, for joining us today and talking a lot about the first-year experience and assessment, and especially how the overlap with student services and how we can show how this course is useful, as well as how we can improve it to ensure that our students are successful as they work through college. So thank you again, and thank you all for joining us today for our conversation with Dr. Harrington. As we noted before, the recording of the webinar along with the slides and resources will be distributed in the next few days. You will all get a copy of that. And I also want to let you know to stay tuned for announcements through the listserv for our next structured conversation, which will be May 2nd at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, when we discuss assessment retreats. So thank you all again, and thank you, Dr. Harrington.
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much, everybody.
Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.